Hello and welcome to Talking Books. I'm Jules de Villiers. At the age of 19, in December 1963, he was shipped off to Robben Island as a political prisoner. This was followed by studies and the start of a banking career in the United States, and then a return to South Africa in 1982. Gaby Magomola then became one of the most iconic black business leaders who rose to prominence during the apartheid years. I am honored to have him in the studio to talk about his life and his book, Robben Island to Wall Street. Welcome, Gaby, and thank you so much for coming in and chatting to us.
Thank you.
Tell me about that day, that Sunday morning, that you were arrested in your home.
Well, I kind of expected it. We had been very active in the political movement as teenagers, trying to find our own ways of dislodging the apartheid government. So we had met clandestinely in various places, in churches, under altars, in graveyards, basically sharpening our weaponry, both politically as well as physically, to take on the mighty apartheid regime at the time.
And you were with the PAC?
With the PAC at the time. I just left the ANC Youth League because some of us thought that the ideas of the ANC Youth League and ANC in particular were good but not militant enough. We were looking for a solution now, and 1963 was the deadline that we thought that was the time to end once and for all this monstrosity called apartheid.
You never expected this to happen?
Well, you mean the arrest?
Yeah,
the arrest. I think it happened sooner than I expected it. We did, when you embark on something that drastic, you prepare yourself for anything that might happen. Arrest being the least, and the worst is, of course, injury or even a fatality. But I didn't expect to be arrested quite that soon. The mission of preparing was not totally complete. Consider that I was a leader in the cell. I had men that I had been trained as a guerrilla fighter, and I had men that were being trained, and so it happened a little too soon.
Your father didn't expect it. He thought you were still going to finish your matric.
Yes, my dad didn't expect it. My dad was a man of the cloth, and so was my mother. He was a pastor, and I attended the church, well, not as regularly as they would have expected me to. So when all that happened, and a lot of it happened in his house without him knowing, because when he wasn't there and the church people were gone, we held our meeting in the church hall inside our yard. Oh. The political meetings.
Oh. Wow. So then on your way to Robben Island, you stopped at several prisons. You stopped at the old Fort prison, and you went through great deprivations in the prisons in the 6 months before you reached Robben Island.
That is absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. We went through a period of awaiting trial while the investigations were taking place, and the apartheid judges were being prepared because there was a mass arrest of thousands of us throughout the country, and the machinery of apartheid was being prepared, and all of them, these judges, as I call them, the apartheid judges, were being prepared to sentence us and take us out of circulation. So within that 6 months, while that was taking place, we were being grilled through South Africa's prisons. I started off in Krugersdorp in the West Rand, ended up at the Fort prison, and our cell, I recall so well, was right next to where Mahatma Gandhi's cell was when he was at the Fort. The Fort is a prison that has housed luminaries such as Robert Sobukwe, Nelson Mandela, and the likes of Mahatma Gandhi, and many women prisoners of note. That's where I spent my real days of understanding what a prison was at number 4 prison, which today has been converted into Constitution Hill, where our constitutional court resides. And that is an incredible irony of it all. Thereafter, once we were sentenced at number 4, well, not at number 4, at the Johannesburg Magistrates Court, we were transferred to another prison outside of Joburg called Leeuwkop Prison, our first taste of a maximum security prison. And we encountered very huge discomforts, to put it very mildly. But that was part of the christening and the preparation for what was to come, i.e. Robben Island.
Now, Robben Island was so bad that it caused many people who were incarcerated there to become very ill.
Robben Island was not a pretty sight when we arrived there. As a matter of fact, I arrived there a couple of days after the assassination of President Kennedy. We were around December 1963. We saw it in the media as we were going to being transported to Robben Island. When we arrived, the prison Robben Island itself was just a huge island. The actual infrastructure was being put into place. And the irony of it all, when we arrived there, we were part of the labor force that built a prison that was going to house us for years. We put up all the bars, the burglars, and the fences, and a lot of us were untrained. We came out of high school and a variety of other careers, and many of us were prepared in what was called the building construction, or the building construction in prison. That's where I learned how to carve a brick and how to break a large stone, make it smaller, and a small stone made finer, so that the smaller stones would be used in the yard, the large stones built and carved for the actual prison walls that were prepared. Wow. But upon arrival, myself and others suffered from tuberculosis because of the extreme conditions. I was very young at the time and rather vulnerable. So about 17 of us were housed at what was called the old prison. And as it just so happened, it is exactly at that prison where Nelson Mandela and the Rivonia trialists were brought in June 1964. We had been there 6 months in prison when they arrived, but I was a seasoned young prisoner. And one of my claims to fame is that I taught Cutthroat and Mandela how to wheel a wheelbarrow and balance it full of stones. Sure. And that's how our friendship endured.
Yeah. But you didn't see him for very long on Robben Island because they split up the earlier inmates and the later.
Absolutely. Part of the reason why they came there was that their prison cells, the Kulukuts, or the isolation block, was still under construction. So they were housed there temporarily while awaiting to be transferred. So it was just one of those fortuitous incidents where they found us there, and we had this incredible journey of about 6 weeks with them, and thereafter they were of course removed once their prison cells were ready. But I stayed there a bit longer because I was still recovering from tuberculosis. As it might have happened, you know, all of us were suffering from TB, about the 17 that were incarcerated in that prison. And Mandela and the Rivonia trialists were mixed freely with us. By that time, I didn't quite understand it, but years later, as you know, he was also afflicted with tuberculosis and some of his mates. So it could have been the effect of what happened in 1964. Yeah.
So you were there for 6 years.
Yes.
And then you came out, and not very long after that, you managed to get a Fulbright Scholarship.
Absolutely. I had, by the time I was in prison, my entire family had been disintegrated. My mother died. My father got into huge alcohol abuse because he couldn't take me being in that situation. My 2 siblings disappeared. And I had not received a letter in 6 years, nor a visit. We were allowed a visit once in 6 months, and 1 letter out and 1 letter in every 6 months. I was unfortunately one of those who never received that visit, so whatever happened in my family came by word of mouth. So when I heard that my family had disintegrated, I then created a vision for myself that I was going to be the torchbearer in the family, and I had the responsibility, so I needed to study. But I didn't have the money to study, because in order to study in prison, you had to have someone with resources, resourcing you with books and whatever the case is. And secondly, you had to be seen to be a well-behaved prisoner. But I was a trumpeter. I played a trumpet for the prisoners, so that created a bit of ambiance for me. So thereafter, I studied and found ways of finishing my matric using other people's books, high school, and passed quite well with a few distinctions, considering I was a prisoner. And afterwards, I carved a career in my mind to go into finance or banking or accounting. And the consequence of that is that after my release, of course, I was again banished for another 2 years to a sisal plantation because the Minister of Justice took a view that I was not sufficiently rehabilitated in prison. There were still remnants of some stuff in me, so I was punished for another 2 years. But during that period, I was able to apply for the Fulbright Scholarship, had met a young lady called Nana who was subsequently married, and then I was successful and left for the United States in the 70s, right just smack in the middle of what was called the Soweto riots.
Wow.
I was snuck out of the country.
Wow. And then you got your MBA and you started working for Citibank,
Yes.
who then brought you back here in 1982.
Correct.
And how did you feel? I would like to try and extend this interview for as long as
Yes.
we possibly
Yeah.
can. So in 1982, how did you feel about coming back?
I had mixed emotions. I had remember by that time as I returned back, I was a full resident, permanent resident, my family and I in the United States. And I had received undertakings from Citibank that I worked for that should things not work out, I would go back and take up my position in New York City on Wall Street. And I arrived here with the view of testing the environment. And once I thought I was reasonably comfortable, I brought my family over and we lived in Soweto in a street called Villiers Street, which is very famous today. And I remember that was out of protest because there was really no place that could accommodate the likes of me. But at the time, the American companies under a campaign called the Leon Principles, Leon Sullivan, a famous American pastor. The American companies built some apartments and I was housed in one of those apartments. And I remember the CEO of Citibank saying, actually, this is great. Down the road is Mr. Mandela's house, and to your right is Archbishop Tutu, one of the men who taught you when you were in high school. So I thought I was in good company. I did not know Villiers Street was going to be as famous as it is. After a few years, maybe 2 years living in Villiers Street, I decided to defy the government's apartheid laws, which prevented black people from living in so-called white designated areas. And I had an arrangement with my bank that I was going to defy and move my family in broad daylight into Sandton. And I've been here now since 1986, after that defiant order. But one of the effects of that I'm very proud of that, is that we built a, if you like, a bridge for the creation of what I think is the first black middle class of South Africa. Because that precedent of us moving into this area encouraged many more like me to find a similar way. And today, I dare say, Sandton is probably proportionately, and as the richest area in South Africa, the place where you find the largest number of black intellectuals and black, shall I say, middle class folk. And that was partly, and I'm not attributing that to what we did, but that symbolic move of defying the apartheid government in 1986 was a contributor to what has happened.
That was at the height of the apartheid. That was with the states of emergency and really the worst time.
Absolutely. It was at the height when people were being thrown out of buildings at police stations under the pretext that they'd thrown themselves out. The security police were still rearresting some of us who had been to Robben Island. And that was the years when there was a so-called third force created by the security police to harass particularly those African leaders that were seen to be influential in the community. Dr. Mutlana, who was a famous physician who turned politician, had become chairman of what was called the Committee of 10 at the time. And one of the things I had done before I moved, because also around that time, as the apartheid regime was getting stronger, we were creating a black business class, you know. Many have attributed part of that to my contribution as the first black managing director of a bank, the first black bank that we created called African Bank. It was created by the Chamber of Commerce, the Black Chamber of Commerce, and I was recalled out of Citibank and then Barclays Bank into heading up that bank. And we were creating a campaign and a message which became very resonant throughout South Africa that said that political freedom is meaningless unless it is linked to economic emancipation. And the African Bank at the time and other creations of NAFCOC presented those tools and vehicles that sensitized African businessmen to the fact that you will not really be in charge when you attain political independence if you are not part of mainstream economy of the country. It is around that time that actually it's in my book where I made a statement in 1986 that no nation can claim to be free unless it has control of its own financial institutions and other institutions where control of capital and credit is created and sustained. If you don't have that as a nation, the political demanacling does not really mean much because you're not in control of the economy. That was the message. That was the creation of what is now called black economic empowerment in South Africa. And we had imported a foreign concept from America called affirmative action, which I'm not quite in favor of because you really should not be affirming a majority of people. But for whatever it matters, that also created a core of new rising black men and women within South Africa's corporations. And for that, of course, my colleagues in the Black Management Forum and other such creations, the African Black Accountants, were really responsible for ensuring that black professionals were being created in those professions. And my call was more in the banking and finance because I was seen as a steward at the time. And I was able to bring and invite more and more black bankers into an area which was alien, which we were forbidden legally as African people to participate, not only as workers, but also as owners.
Now, you were very outspoken at the time and very firm in your thoughts and so on, but you were a little bit premature in terms of getting acceptance for what you believed in so firmly at that stage at the African Bank. And in 1989, you were asked to step down, is that correct?
Correct. And there's a nice, I think I had been a little bit too controversial and outspoken with hindsight. I remember a stage when I was at a conference when the Prime Minister, Mr. Botha, they called him the crocodile, the large crocodile, invited me to a meeting and told me that I have to tone down the things I was saying because I would find myself with time under the influence of communists and the likes of that. And I think also I was a little too brash for a businessman or a banker. My political views overrode my business acumen, I must even say so, to the extent that I became a bit of a threat, and perhaps to other members that some of my colleagues a little bit, it became a bit uncomfortable. I was actually shown the door at African Bank because there were a number of other things we were doing all at the time for the ANC and for Mr. Mandela. And I must also state that at that stage I was one of the stewards of everything, of many of the citations and honors that Nelson Mandela was receiving in prison. We kept them at the bank where I worked under my stewardship, but that was leaked out to the media. It was also leaked out that we're beginning to assist the ANC in its campaign, which was the predominant organization of the liberation movement then.
Yeah, so and when you lost your job then,
yes,
you went into a depression.
Yes.
And how did you handle that? How did your wife handle that?
It was a huge depression. I had committed myself. I was living in an expensive area, and I had committed myself in a way that required large resources. So I was kind of thrown into the deep end. My wife was at law school at the University of Witwatersrand, and she was pregnant with our baby. So I almost got into a depression. I was really just this much away. But considering the fact that I was not only a family man, I was also, in a sense, viewed as a business leader and in South Africa. And I had started a movement and a campaign of independence, of African independence from, in an economic sense. I needed to ensure that my dignity is preserved. I needed to ensure that my sanity levels did not sink to a situation where I would be totally destroyed. And thanks God, I had a very strong wife and a very strong family. And we came out of that and created another organization called the Foundation for African Business. And it's still in the middle of apartheid. And we became the strongest black federal organization in South Africa. Out of that, we were able to create another bank called Future Bank, along with First National Bank, which catered for the burgeoning taxi industry. We were the largest wheels bank at the time after the FNB, our partners. Subsequent to that, we created, there wasn't a single insurance company owned by African people. We created African General Insurance, which became also the first black-owned and controlled insurance company in the casualty, short term. So the creation, the dream hadn't died. Perhaps the fire hadn't died. What had perhaps extinguished somewhat was the credibility after my run in at African Bank. But that did not, as I say, I did not allow that depression to set me back. You know, the journey still had to continue.
And then the ANC was unbanned and things changed. And
oh, absolutely. When that happened, everything changed. Mr. Mandela was released out of prison. Within days, I was lucky enough, he invited me over to the Carlton Hotel to just state to me how proud he was that 19-year-old he had met in prison in 1964 had matured into what I was. And we had a lovely champagne at the Carlton Hotel, me and his family and my wife. Thereafter, a number of other things continued. The hardship, the laws that prevented black business people from doing certain, I mean, like for example, trading in the city. Remember that at that time, there was an act called the Job Reservations Act that prevented African people from doing certain types of jobs. All of that was getting dismantled. The ANC was getting ready for its role as the next government. And the next phase then was to create a new what I call a new campaign, which we call Black Economic Empowerment. In 1993, October, we called a large summit inviting all the leaders of the ANC, all the leaders of the black business movement into the Kruger National Park, where we had a run-in for 3 days with the ANC, basically sharing with them our experiences that have prevented us to becoming major players and instilling in them what we thought was something that they would understand, and I think to a large extent they did. That is partnering with black business as new government. Some of the people that were there included Trevor Manuel, who became Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, who became the governor of the Reserve Bank, Cyril Ramaphosa, who became this and now is president of the country. They were all there with us, and the consequence of that meeting is that we signed a memorandum of agreement called the Mopani Agreement that I was part of, which bound the ANC in an ethical sense to a view that said that they were going to be a support system to the new burgeoning black business movement.
We are at the end of our interview. Can you just tell me very briefly how you feel now, looking back, what we have achieved in the interim from then to now?
I think that we have actually underachieved. And I think part of the reason has got to do with the fact that although ideas abound within black business leaders, the ability to raise capital, the ability to raise credit and access markets, the scarcity of management, top management, because of, again, the legacy of past systems, has in a way created a challenge for the rapid growth that some of us had anticipated after apartheid. I am actually regretful of the fact that to this day, we don't have what we might call a genuinely African or black-owned financial institution of any measure. In fact, let me put it just very bluntly. We don't have we don't have a black-owned bank. We don't have a majority black-owned bank, a majority insurance. Things have not really moved. If you go back to my statement of 1984 that I made to Financial Mail, that no black nation can hold itself proud unless it owns its own financial institutions. And you come back at 84, it's been 34 years now. I am not proud of the fact that we haven't achieved those goals and ideals. And I'm just hoping that the younger generation who might have a chance to listen to this interview and others will understand that there's a great challenge. We sowed the seeds, we kicked the doors of apartheid open, and we left every single door and opening available. It is for them to enter into that realm and do what needs to be done.
Wow, indeed. Gaby Magomola, thank you so much for coming in and chatting to us.
It's a pleasure.
And the book is From Robben Island to Wall Street. That's brought us to the end of today's show, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.